What is up, guys? Super excited today. I have Greg Schmaus. He is the CEO of Healing 4D. He has a course out, and it's called Healing Your Core Archetypes. And we're going to get into this today, and I think it's going to be mind-blowing for a lot of you. He also has a Healing the Mind, a holistic 21-day mental health program. But Greg's unique approach blends physical and mental health. He guides individuals globally towards empowerment and self-awareness through authentic lifestyle practices. So this is going to be a very practical podcast today. His expertise is rooted in over a decade of coaching. I had heard him on a podcast, and I've talked a lot about Paul CHEK, and you guys know about him. He has been taught under. He's your mentor, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And so this is going to be exciting. We're going to get into archetypes. We're going to get into holistic healing, and we're going to get into personal growth. So I know a lot of you have asked me, having guests that are not, I know the archetypes are kind of esoteric. Greg and I were talking off air on that, but I think this is going to be something that you're going to be able to put in your day-to-day life. So Greg, thank you for being on Higher Density Living Podcast today.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
I want to kind of get into what, on a very practical basis, what is an archetype and what led you personally to start studying them?
So archetypes really represent the language of the psyche. So they're essentially, very simply put, they're the roles that we play, the patterns that we act out, the vehicles that we use for self-expression, and the vehicles that we use to come to know ourselves through relationship. Right? So anytime we're coming into relationship, we're using archetypes as vehicles or as a means of doing that. Whether it's a student archetype and a teacher archetype coming together, or a victim and a rescuer coming together. If we look at all of our stories and movies and myths, all the characters represent archetypes that are coming into relationship with one another. And the reason we so resonate with certain stories, certain myths, certain movies, certain characters are the archetypes that they represent. So archetypes are really the language that we're always connecting to, and it's a means for us to come to know ourselves on a deeper level.
What led you, personally, to look at archetypes? Was there, any trauma or drama or something that happened, or was there just a relation to self-awareness? How did you learn these?
Well, throughout my healing journey, I always had this desire to really come to know myself on a deeper level, to understand, why do I say the things that I say? Why do I do the things that I do? Why am I interested or passionate about the things that I'm interested or passionate about? And I also arrived at this point in my own healing journey where I found myself very subtly sabotaging myself in certain ways, whether it was not eating foods that were good for my body or making choices that I knew were not in alignment with, my own healing, my own potential, my own growth. And I really wanted to understand first for myself, why was I sabotaging myself? And number two, once I started working with clients, why certain clients would heal and others would not? Why certain clients would know that these maybe diet and lifestyle changes or practices, they knew that it was good for them, but for some reason they weren't doing those things. So I really wanted to understand the essence of self-sabotage. And I wanted to understand also something that I started to see in my own life, which was the part of me that on some level was holding on to pain, that may have been benefiting from illness, and the part of me that actually had some secondary gain in not healing. So there were these roadblocks that I was meeting in my personal and professional life, and I really wanted to come to understand those, and archetypes became the perfect vehicle or language to really understand and put real concrete meaning and understanding to what was going on.
So was it for yourself personally, or for me, one of the issues, and I've talked about this openly, one of the issues that I've had in the past, and I've been working on, is food addiction. So, but I've noticed that if I get depressed, then that's where that craving hits. That's where that goes, and then I've noticed being masculine on that polarity, having the anger is really a mask for fear. So being able to see those, and then me playing, and you mentioned something, sabotaging your life. When you see somebody, and you do a lot of coaching, when you see somebody and they can't handle good in their life, like the minute that they get to a certain level of goodness in their life, they sabotage themselves. Is that because they're playing out this role in this, movie life, this archetype? And how does that relate with you?
So when someone is sabotaging progress or sabotaging growth, whatever it might be, a lot of times, or sabotaging, say, like financial abundance,
right?
There could be, number one, some core fear. So one of the best questions you can ask yourself is, what am I afraid would happen if I actually healed? What am I afraid would happen if I actually had all the money that a part of me desires? What am I actually afraid would happen if I actually reached that milestone or whatever it is? So number one is there's a core fear. Number two, there's very often some sort of old belief system that we end up sabotaging ourselves to try and confirm. Like, for example, many of us have an inner critic. And a lot of times we criticize ourselves or are very hard on ourselves for ways in which we know we're sabotaging ourselves. So we think, oh, well, if I stop sabotaging myself, I wouldn't criticize myself as much. It's like, well, maybe it's actually the opposite. Maybe you're sabotaging yourself to give yourself more things to criticize.
Yes.
Based on a belief system you have about yourself, whether it's that you're not good enough, you're not lovable enough, you're not worthy enough, whatever belief system that is in your ego structure, you're going to always look for evidence that that's true. You're always going to look for some sort of material to confirm that belief, even though you know it's like a limited one or probably isn't really based in reality, and on a deeper level probably isn't even yours.
That's so good, man. I'm already writing down a bunch of stuff. Before we get into the belief systems and get more down, I want to nail down the sabotaging thing. Before we get into that, can you kind of go over the archetypes so people can understand that? And then we're going to dig right back in.
Yep. So we all have 4 survival archetypes. And these are 4 core archetypes that I go over in my course. And the reason these 4 are so important are they're universal, right? We all have these 4. Nobody on this planet exists without these 4 survival archetypes. And the reason for that is because they're your survival mechanisms. These are the 4 ways that you learned how to survive, going back to your childhood. Anytime you felt unsafe, anytime you felt threatened, or anytime you felt some level of disconnection. And these are the child, the victim, the saboteur, and the prostitute. So the child archetype represents your inner child. This is the first archetype that we're introduced to because we come into the world as this helpless, powerless child who's totally dependent on some mother or father archetype or some caretaker for its own survival. So the child archetype learns, who do I have to become to get my physical needs met, to get my survival needs met, and to get my emotional needs met. So that's the essence of the child archetype. And there's light and shadow to all of these. These are not all bad.
Who do I have to become?
Exactly.
That's the important part. Oh, that's so good.
Exactly. And then at some point, usually in our childhood, we have some sort of experience where we feel like we're a victim. Whether we feel like someone's crossing a physical boundary through like physical abuse, someone's crossing an emotional boundary through emotional abuse, but some situation in which we feel unsafe, in which we feel like we're being attacked, persecuted, or we're being victimized in some way, right? Any experience where we feel unsafe or a boundary is being crossed, we're introduced to the victim archetype. And as soon as we're introduced to that situation, we create almost like a survival strategy, right? We have a survival strategy for the victim, which might be to shut down or to disconnect or to self-soothe, or, the empowered victim, the light side, would be setting the boundary, right? Setting the physical boundary, taking yourself out of an unsafe situation. So there's empowered ways to step into the victim, which is boundary setting. And then there's disempowered ways of being in the victim, which could also be how I get my emotional needs met by being the victim.
Yeah, and we see this a lot, especially right now. I mean, we've seen this played out through mankind, but right now in society, we're seeing this victim playing out big time.
Yeah, and the victim represents your relationship with your own power. Right? So the light side of it is you empower yourself to set boundaries and take action when you feel like you're being victimized. The shadow side is, paradoxically, you play a powerless role as a way of gaining a sense of power and control. Right? It could be, I play the powerless victim to attract a rescuer, which allows me to get my emotional needs met. Right? Like for me as a child, when I was the victim who was in pain or injured, my dad, who was a physician, I felt more loved and connected to him. Right? So the shadow side is how we get certain needs met and feel a sense of power and control by playing the powerless victim. So that's the shadow side of it.
And religion can play a role in this too. I was raised like fundamentalist. So you're never good enough. You're always a sinner. You always need to repent. Are you going to hell or heaven? So you're almost like I almost was like a fearful victim to the religion.
Yeah. And, if we take Christianity, for example, Christianity archetypally is based on the martyr. Right. So Jesus represents the martyr archetypally, which is the archetype of self-sacrifice. Right. And a lot of people take that teaching and turn it into self-victimization.
Yes.
I'm doing for everyone else. I never have enough time for myself. And then we go into, for example, patterns of self-soothing, right? Which is an aspect of the victim archetype. I grew up in a Jewish family. If you read the Old Testament and you go into a lot of the Jewish texts, God was like this judgmental, like jealous, punishing God, where, there's a strong victim archetype in the Jewish tradition. Right. So if you just look at it archetypally, you can see a lot of these survival archetypes that are showing up throughout religious teachings and religious traditions.
Yeah, I love that. And the saboteur, you said, was the third one?
Yep. Saboteur is the one that most people are aware of, which is the archetype of self-sabotage. And the saboteur is there to protect you from truth. It's there to protect you from your own power. And it's there to protect you from anything that feels unfamiliar or inconvenient to the ego. Right? Because the saboteur in you knows that once you step into your power and once you step into your truth, everything changes. Sometimes shit hits the fan, your life gets turned upside down. An example that I like to give very simply is, I spent 3 decades of my life as a chronic people pleaser, saying yes to everybody, trying to be who I think everyone else wants me to be, kind of like the archetype of the shapeshifter. And then all of a sudden, I start stepping into my power or connecting with my truth, and I start saying no to things. I start setting boundaries with people. And all of a sudden, there are certain people in my life that realized that they were getting their needs met by the lesser empowered version of me. So all of a sudden, my relationships are turned upside down because everyone's like, what the hell happened to Greg? I liked the old version of him better when he was saying yes to me all the time. Right?
And you probably attracted those type of people.
Absolutely.
That would take advantage of.
Absolutely. So the saboteur in me knows that once I step into my power or once I align with my truth, so many things in my life that are no longer in alignment with that will get turned upside down. So the saboteur tries to protect you from the inconvenience or discomfort of that.
Yeah, I'm super introverted, and I think that's part of that. I've noticed that I have a tendency to be, I feel like I'm not good enough. So I need to overperform at work, and I'm usually, I do the sacrificing. I work the 12, 15-hour days. I do those things just to be like, hey, boss, am I good enough? That type of thing. I've noticed that throughout my life. And so my introvertness, because we see this a lot, empaths, introverts, all these things. Do you think this is just a lot of it could be this archetype and protecting yourself?
Yeah. So some people might also sabotage them. Like you might go to one extreme of overworking yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Someone might go to the other extreme of sabotaging themselves, all to confirm the belief system they have about themselves, which is that they're not good enough.
Yes.
Right. So it's actually two extremes, both of which are a response to the same core belief.
So they would just run from relationship to relationship, just running away from everything.
Yeah. And like you said, also the empathic, sensitive, introverted individual is someone that also has a tendency to absorb other people's emotions, other people's pain, other people's experiences, and have a hard time differentiating theirs from others. So that's also an expression of the victim archetype, which is when there's not a clear boundary between your experience and someone else's experience, the victim inside of us feels as though we're carrying everyone else's stuff. Right? So that can lead to patterns of self-soothing. That can lead to the introvert or the hermit having a tendency to check out rather than tune in when they're spending alone time with themselves.
That's crazy. On my screensaver right now, I have the tarot card for the hermit.
There you go. So the hermit is an archetype that
Right.
if you want to pay attention to how you're in relationship with that archetype, when you're spending time alone, are you tuning in or checking out?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's also connected to the victim, right? We're usually checking out when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel burdened, when we feel like we've given ourselves away, when we're feeling kind of like a victim of life. That's when we have a tendency to check out. And
That's so good.
self-care becomes self-soothing.
So yeah, that's really, really good. So these can kind of like, and we'll get into the prostitute because people are like, prostitute, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
So these can kind of play off of each other. Like I'm already seeing me being introverted, victim, saboteur. Like,
Yep. They're all intimately connected with one another. They're all communicating with each other. For example, one of my forms of self-sabotage is not speaking my truth, not voicing what I'm feeling. And the reason for that is when I was growing up, speaking, sharing, and vocalizing my truth or my feeling or my experience didn't feel safe. I felt like I might get attacked. I felt like I might get persecuted. I grew up in a Jewish family full of attorneys. So if you share something at the dinner table or at the holiday, like be ready for, a counter argument or cross-examination. So my form of self-sabotage of not speaking my truth may have been to protect me from being victimized.
So, and see that once again, I mean, Greg, you're just going crazy on this. This is awesome. The safe I want to get into later too, but let's finish this list and kind of not go down too many rabbit trails and continue with the prostitute.
So the prostitute is the archetype of self-compromise, right? The prostitute is where we compromise our values, compromise our integrity, or compromise our sense of self-worth or self-esteem, all to ensure some form of some sort of guaranteed outcome, essentially. Right? The prostitute's always looking for a guarantee. And that's usually a result of low self-worth, low self-esteem. And it's usually based in your desire for safety, security, and survival. It's all almost like root chakra driven. All these survival archetypes are root chakra driven responses to situations.
How would this play out in the masculine? Because everybody's thinking prostitute, and then they may think more of especially the guys out there listening, they may think it's more of a female thing, in relationships. But how does this play out, in the masculine side?
So it universally plays out. For example, let's say you get a job offer. Let's say my values are to eat organic food. And I get a job offer from Monsanto.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Which is, we'll pay you $10 million a year to be an advisor to us. And I say yes. Right? So I'm saying yes for guaranteed financial security at the expense of my own values and integrity.
That's so good. Yes.
Right? And a smaller example of that could be when I was 12 years old and my mom would give me, $10 to go to the movies and to get some snacks with some friends at the movie theater. I remember buying my friends movie tickets. And at the time I was like, oh, I'm just being nice. I'm being a good friend. I'm being generous. But looking back, as I started to do some of this archetypal work, I realized that was my prostitute. Because I was very introverted and quiet-natured as a child. So socially, I didn't feel very confident in myself. So buying my friends movie tickets was buying their loyalty. It was buying a guarantee out of the low self-worth or low self-esteem that I didn't think that they would just want to be friends with me because of me. So I bought an insurance policy.
And a lot of relationships are this way. They do the same thing because they don't feel like they're good enough. So they'll put up with the asshole, whatever it is. They'll put up with, the cheating or whatever it may be. They're willing to compromise their ethics, values. Is that based off of insecurity, do you think? Or is it based off of self-worth? Or do you think there's something deeper than that?
It's all self-worth and self-esteem related. And a lot of it is about trusting yourself.
That's a key word, yes.
Yeah. So a lot of it is around self-trust. And this is also the archetype that interferes with intuition. Because intuition often guides you in directions that go against what feels safe and secure. Right? Like maybe you're working as an accountant or you're working on Wall Street and your higher self or intuition tells you to go be an artist. And your inner prostitute says, well, that's not a good idea. You're getting a guaranteed paycheck here by working as an accountant. So you see the prostitute running interference on the intuition. And that's where we have a tendency to not listen to our inner instincts. Because one of the survival archetypes is running interference on that.
I think for me, it would be compromise would be the way that I would play this archetype out. Like I would say, well, I could keep my job and then I'll do art at night, and, I'll just do it for 4 hours and I'll commit to those 4 hours, So it's like a compromise.
Well, the light side of the prostitute is not compromise, but negotiation. Right? Like an example I like to give is, let's say you called me up and said, hey, Greg, I'd like to do a coaching session on some of these archetypes. Sure. When would you like to do it? And you said, how about tomorrow at 3 a.m.? I would say no, because one of my values is to be asleep at that time.
Right.
Right. I value my rest. But then if you said, I'll give you $40,000 for the session, I would be there at 2:45.
Right. Yeah,
right. Because that's a place where I know my value and the transaction feels worth it. So I'm willing to negotiate one of my values right then and there for something that feels like it's delivering me equal or more value.
That's so good.
So the
Yes.
light side of the prostitute is first know your worth, and then know what you have to offer and know how to negotiate from that place of empowerment, rather than you just paying me my standard rate and me saying yes to 3 a.m. out of the fear that if I say no, I might lose you as a client,
Right.
right?
100%.
So it's more out of the fear of abandonment or rejection than actually knowing my worth.
That's wild. I want to get into the old belief system that you talked about, because that wraps and encapsulates just the ego and all four of these. And in this survival, I mean, we'll get into safety and thriving, and how to deal with each of these. But what is that old belief system that maybe people don't even realize they have?
I mean, it's different for many of us, but this is where going into the child archetype is so valuable, of really understanding, what were the gifts of your inner child? What were the wounds of your inner child? And a big one that I like to ask people is, what was your true nature or your natural state of being before you learned that that was not okay? Right? So there's when you start to explore these things, you arrive at some sort of core wound.
Mm.
Whether it was the wound of judgment, rejection, abandonment, that you're not enough, that you're not, whatever it is. And then once there's a core wound, there's what's called a contract that one signs as a result of adapting to the wound, right? For example, if it's the wound of judgment, the contract might be to judge myself a little bit more than everyone else does. If the wound was rejection, the contract might be for me to reject myself before anyone else has the opportunity to. If the wound was abandonment, the contract might be to abandon myself before anyone else abandons me. All right. So there's a core wound, then there's a core contract that's created to protect the wound. And the contract is usually where a lot of the patterns of self-sabotage reside. Right? It could be saying yes to everyone because there's a fear that if I say no, then I might get abandoned, or I might get attacked, or I might get persecuted. So there's some core belief system that is developed at the time of a core wound. And then we create a contract around that of who we have to become, how we have to adapt to make sure that we never re-experience or reopen that wound. And that's where it varies person to person.
Yeah, sorry about that, for interrupting you. When we look at these wounds, because there's so many of them, core wounds, so I kind of want to go, and I know you've probably dealt this with clients. When you're looking at somebody that's been hurt deeply, maybe, a parent abandoned them, maybe sexual molestation, something like that. I've been hearing a lot of this, especially on the male side, where men don't want to admit that those things happen to them.
Yeah.
What do you have something, when you deal with clients and it's something that's really dramatic, like a core wound, how do you pull that out? And then obviously people know, like, I mean, instantly I was thinking about, that I'm not good enough, connecting that with all this, personally. But how do you get people to understand, without too much trauma, them understanding their core wound?
I mean, a couple ways. The first thing is there's usually a very simple breadcrumb trail that you can follow back.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And a lot of it can start with the ways in which we are managing ourselves or relating to others present day, right? There's a lot of ways in which our current choices and behaviors are actually still protective mechanisms for a wound that we acquired maybe 20, 30 years ago. And also, I love A Course in Miracles.
Yes, I do too. Yeah.
And in A Course in Miracles, one of the teachings in there is to practice the statement of, I'm not feeling blank for the reason that I think I am, right? I'm not feeling angry for the reason that I think I am,
Mhm.
right? So, for example, one day I came home from work and my partner was really overwhelmed and agitated and was pointing out all the things in the house that I didn't get around to doing that I said I was going to do. And all of a sudden, there was this huge wave of anger coming up inside of me. And I just kind of took some space and went into my own body and my own emotional state and just connected with that anger. And beneath that anger was a lot of deep shame. That anger was kind of a protective layer of a really deep shame. And one of the best questions to ask yourself is, how old does this part of me feel? When I'm feeling this emotion, how old do I feel? And that part of me felt like 9 years old. And then I asked that part of me what he was feeling or believing to be true. And he said, whatever I do, it's never good enough.
Mm.
I came home from a full day of work, of coaching clients and helping people. And the first thing that I receive when I get home are all the things that I didn't do. Right? So there was this 9-year-old inside of me that was responding, 20 something years later to a situation that was confirming or reinforcing a belief that he has about himself, that whatever he does, it's never enough. And the anger was the protective shield to try and preserve that kind of ashamed inner child that has that core belief about himself. So there's usually everyday situations that are being presented to you as a means of bringing up any core wound that still needs to be healed. So if you look at also a lot of the triggers in your daily life, in your current relationships, you could see those people as characters in your reality that are put in certain places and positions to say certain things to activate any core wound that's still unhealed. So if you just look at your everyday life, you're going to find the breadcrumb trail that leads you back to a core wound or a core belief.
That's so good. And so this contract, and I know there's spiritual implications with this, but so we have the core wound, and then we make this, and I like the word contract because it's almost, like legal binding. It's this thing that we've, through our old belief system, have, and our ego says, stay safe, stay safe. So how do you look at the contract, ego, safety, all of these things? How does the contract play out in day-to-day life?
So the survival archetypes are always there to ensure safety and security.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that ensures our survival. But as we all know, surviving is different from thriving. And so what the contract says is, I'm willing to sacrifice my freedom and empowerment for safety and security. And usually pain arises when we've gotten to a point where that old contract of safety and security is limiting our freedom and empowerment enough that it's starting to create pain. And pain, whether it's physical pain, mental, emotional pain, is really almost like our soul's feedback mechanism, letting us know that an old contract is expired. And if we don't step into the new one, the pain messenger, the volume's going to get turned up until we really acknowledge the contract that's expired, the patterns of safety and security that we're being asked to let go of, so we can now step into our sense of freedom and empowerment.
Because I think safety, especially now, we could see this played out in society. People are willing to give up their freedoms. They're willing to give up a lot for safety, like safety and comfort. And I think comfort would be a big word that would pretty much be safety. Do you see this playing out? Is this the archetype that's playing out collectively? in society, especially here, especially in developed countries like the UK, Canada, United States, there seems to be this, I'll give you whatever it takes for me to be safe.
Yes. Yes. And I think the COVID pandemic was a perfect example of this. We had this virus that was, apparently like going around killing everybody. So the virus archetypally becomes the villain.
Ooh, this is good. Yes, I like this.
We are the victims that are being threatened or under attack from the villain. So we're told to, stay home, social distance, wear masks, whatever it might be. So we go into our own victimhood, feeling like there's this invisible victim that's a villain that's out there to get us. So now we're in our survival archetypes. We're sitting at home waiting for essentially authority figures to tell us what to do, to make choices for us.
As the child?
Which creates the child archetype and the archetypal parent.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, like you were saying, we start sabotaging our own freedoms out of the fear of survival, which is the saboteur. And then obviously there are many forms of compromising of values, things being done for financial gain, lack of integrity. So there's the prostitute archetype. So when it comes to just the pandemic, you can see that it's just a magnification of survival archetypes.
That's so good because that's so real. Like, I mean, everybody experienced this.
Yeah.
And it played out, all four of these played out perfectly.
And that's why this work is so powerful, but it's also so easy, because it's so easy to see your personal stuff playing out collectively and see the collective patterns showing up personally. So when they say like the world is a mirror, if you look at it through the lens of archetypes, it's so much easier to see that mirror very clearly. And one of the beauties of this also is archetypes are collective patterns. They're not personal. And when they're not personal, it makes it so much easier for you to explore without your ego getting threatened, right? Because when you realize that I have a victim, but everyone has a victim. I have a prostitute, everyone has a prostitute. Or when you start looking at relationships through the lens of archetypes, you also don't take things as personally, because you realize that it's just archetypes playing themselves out and it has nothing to do with you. Right? So
it's just a role.
Yeah, it's a vehicle, it's a role, it's a pattern that we play out so we come to know ourselves in ways that we get our emotional needs met. And it's when you understand the archetypal dynamics of relationships, you don't take things as personally anymore.
Yeah, because you could turn around and you could tell your partner, I'm just playing the victim right now, or I'm playing the prostitute.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it relieves a lot of, I could see that. That would be super awesome. So I want to take the next few minutes that we have, and I want to get into thriving. We've got into the surviving side. After people understand this, they begin to know, they see their old belief systems, they see how their ego's working, they see the core wounds, core contracts, they understand these four survival. How do you begin to transform somebody into thriving?
Well, before I try and force someone into that,
right,
I want them to understand the patterns of self-sabotage, the patterns of their victim archetype. I want them to really understand what needs were getting met by playing those archetypes out, right? For example, maybe I was holding on to pain, like I was saying, to get emotional needs met from my parents. Maybe someone else is holding on to pain because they're getting medical leave from a job that they don't enjoy, And they're getting emotional needs met from the therapist that they're seeing because they're not getting those needs met at home in their intimate relationship.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yes.
So the first step before trying to force someone out of these archetypes is to understand the deep needs that are getting met in these archetypes. And once they understand, oh wow, I was getting a lot more empathy and compassion when I was in pain. Okay, cool. Well, first of all, how can you start to offer yourself that empathy and compassion? And what are the relationships that you need to let your needs be known more clearly and speak up and advocate for yourself so you can get those emotional needs met in a healthier way, in a conscious way, rather than you having to play the victim or self-sabotage as a way of getting those needs met in an unconscious way.
So
So
it's, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
the first step is to really understand what are the needs that are getting met by playing out these survival archetypes in their shadow expression. So then we can learn how to get these needs met in a more empowered way in the light expression. So I think that's how we move from surviving to thriving, is to first understand what the deeper need that was getting met was.
So clarity of pattern, seeing how my needs are getting met. I'll use a quick example on this for myself, and then we'll get into the light side of these. Cleaning, doing dishes, loading dishwasher, laundry with my partner. It's like, hey, I'm going to do these things. You should pay attention to me when I do them. Isn't this amazing that I did this? Even though I only do, she does, 80% of it and I do 20, but when I do it, it's very special.
Yes.
And while I'm doing it, I have a bad attitude the whole time. Like, why didn't she do this? Why am I having to do this?
Yeah.
So that's just the victim archetype being played out. And that's a pattern that I have because that emotion goes every time I do something.
That's also the archetype. I'm going to bring in a couple other archetypes. It's also the archetype of either the knight or the hero. Right? The hero likes to be the one that saves the day. The knight likes to be the knight in shining armor. And there's almost like this grandiosity to its actions or its contributions. And it's always looking for the recognition that it's not offering itself. So the knight and the hero would be some of the archetypes that are showing up there. Also, you might actually be, this is one very common for me, is there's a part of me that identifies as the rescuer.
Yeah, I dated younger women just for that reason, so that I could appear spiritual. So now my partner, she's, we're both spiritual and same age, everything. But I had to break that pattern, and I did that for years and years and years. I always was looking for somebody, for me to be the knight, for me to be the spiritual guru, for me to, I'm the one that has all the knowledge and all the wisdom. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so the knight is always looking for a damsel. And a rescuer is always looking for a victim.
Yes.
Right? Those are archetypal contracts.
You can combine them too, yeah.
Right? Those are contracts. So, and the truth is the damsel's looking for a knight and the victim's also looking for a rescuer. So it works both ways. But the issue is if I'm always in the archetype of the knight, the woman I'm in relationship, I lock her into the role of the damsel. Or if I'm always in my rescuer, always saving the day, I lock the other person into their inner victim. Right? So whatever archetypal role I'm attached to, I'm going to lock the other person into that. And the truth is, a lot of relationships either change, end, or start to feel stressful just actually when the archetypal roles start to change. Right? For example, if there's a rescuer-victim relationship and the rescuer decides to no longer be the rescuer, the victim might not be getting their needs met anymore. Or let's say the victim
Empowerment. Yeah.
starts to empower themselves and step out of their own victimhood.
Yes.
Now the rescuer has no one to save anymore, so their sense of meaning and purpose and value is no longer present in the relationship that once was.
Yeah, I had that in a relationship. Same thing. And I was like, why don't you love me anymore?
Mhm.
But it was the whole, she found somebody else, of course, that was more, not so rescuer. But that was the whole relationship, me being the rescuer.
Yeah. So relationship challenges are really just shifts in archetypes. Right. And
it's
when you
crazy
can
that
see that,
you pigeonhole somebody into that archetype. Like you're role play, both of you are role playing that so-called relationship. It's not really even a beautiful spiritual loving relationship.
yeah. And it's one of the ways that the saboteur is also responsible for sabotaging others, not just sabotaging yourself.
So most people feel love based off of these core wounds, where they're having somebody come in and heal one of these core wounds, or these contracts, and then they're viewing that as a relationship with one of these archetypes. That's heavy duty.
Most relationships start out, or part of the purpose to a lot of relationships are healing and resolving a lot of unfinished business. Right? So a lot of times, and this is also why understanding the mother and father archetype are so important, are a lot of our core wounds go back to our relationships with mom and dad. And whatever we haven't healed with our relationship with mom, for example, we're going to, on some level, try and heal that through other women. Or whatever core wound we have with dad, there's a part of us that is going to try and heal that through our relationships with other men. And if it's not heal that, it might be reinforce it.
Yeah, a lot of younger men have the archetype with mom. So they're
Mhm.
just looking for another mother.
Yeah. So, something that I was aware of, for example, in my partnership was, on our 4th anniversary, we went out for dinner and we were sharing just like the gifts that we've offered each other. And one thing that I shared with my partner was, I've never been with someone who can hold me to my potential, hold me accountable to my potential, and also meet me in my deepest vulnerability at the same time.
That's
and
good.
and I realized that my mom represented someone who could always caretake me in my vulnerability, but would never hold me to my potential. She would kind of give me a pass. Where my father was always holding the potential, but couldn't meet me in my vulnerability. So my partner actually represented the marriage of the two. And that's what I actually seeked out in partnership, were the pieces of that puzzle of the potential on one polarity, which you could say is the masculine, what my father represented, and the vulnerability and the meeting me in my deepest, darkest moment, which was the feminine, which was what my mother represented. So a lot of times our partnership, we choose people to reflect back to us the missing pieces of ourselves.
That's so good. And that's so awesome that you were able to talk to your partner and have that conversation. That's heavy duty. And to have that self-awareness. So you develop that self-awareness through understanding the archetypes, to be able to, how many conversations are in relationships where you're like sitting down, nice dinner, I presume, it's 4-year anniversary, and you're like, thank you for holding me accountable to my potential. And that's like you said, that's masculine. And then also I want to thank you for meeting me in my vulnerability and allowing me to express that. That's the feminine. That's so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing when you start seeing relationships archetypally, exactly how the contracts are being played out. It's pretty remarkable when you see it that way. And that's one reason I think also a lot of people are drawn to plant medicine work, is when you're in medicine ceremony, a lot of the visions that you have, the things that are being shown to you, are the archetypal representation of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So a lot of the images and the things that are shown to you are archetypes, right? Because you're being shown the psyche, you're being shown the patterns. And the medicine work, from my experience, opens the gates to seeing those much more clearly. But obviously, just with this podcast and the course that I created and a lot of this content, it allows you to see it without having to go off into the jungle.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's important because that can get missed. That you in this moment can do spiritual work. Yeah. Like there are disciplines that you can do right now. You don't need to run to Costa Rica or go to like you just said. You don't need to go to the jungles. There are things that you can do right now in this very moment that can change your life dramatically.
Yeah, like one of our mutual teachers, Paul CHEK, says, if you want to grow spiritually, you don't need a church or a temple. You just need a committed relationship.
100%. Yeah, if you look at it as that way, it's like that's something I've had to get into. And Paul CHEK talks about the raw teachings, but one of the things that I learned from the Law of One raw teachings was learn, teach, learn. So everything in life is, I'm learning and I'm teaching and I'm teaching and I'm learning. And when you approach any type of relationship that way, it opens freedom. It gives you tons of freedom to be able to look at this and say, and I think it creates this peace and humility where I can say, I'm going to learn something here, and this is exciting.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think people are getting excited listening to you with these archetypes, because this is giving a lot of people hope. Because, and I know you hear this and you do this every day with the coaching, Greg, and I think this is beautiful what you're doing, because it's a simple way for people to, oh, okay, I am being the child. And I've been the child for 30 plus fucking years, and this is me acting it out, and then it's so easy to understand. And you put it in such a beautiful way. So I appreciate you for that.
Yeah. And once you understand that whatever choice we're making, whatever archetype we're playing out, whatever behavior it is, we can be really hard on ourselves for patterns of self-sabotage or whatever it might be. But when we remind ourselves that there's always a part of us that's benefiting from it, there's always a need that's getting met that we haven't yet learned how to meet in a conscious way, we can have some compassion for ourselves. And one of the things that I, have shared with people and try and practice in my own life is the balance between accountability and compassion.
Yes.
And, if we have compassion for ourselves, but we don't hold ourselves accountable, we're just always giving ourselves a pass and becoming apathetic. But if we're always holding ourselves accountable, but not offering us compassion, we don't give ourselves the understanding and the loving support that we need. So I think that like masculine accountability and feminine compassion need to be in right balance for us to really support ourselves through the growing pains of, this incarnation.
I love that. And I want to close on this, Greg. Could you take just a few moments and talk about your Healing Your Core Archetypes course? So if somebody goes to and share your website, and then can you kind of walk through what they'll be learning and kind of what they can realize and why it's so important for them to be in this course?
Yeah, so my new course, Healing Your Core Archetypes, A Journey of Empowerment, is the course that I created as a result of all the things that we've talked about today. And in the course, we go through 7 key archetypes, which are the 4 survival archetypes that we talked about, and then the mother, father, and then the final one is the Imago Dei, which represents the image of God. And the reason that one is so important is whatever your beliefs around God are, that informs all the other archetypes.
Yes.
Right? So we dive into these 7 key archetypes, which for me are really the 7 aspects of ourselves that are at the root of the healing journey, the most common core blockages, and the reasons that people don't heal And once we clear some of the patterns associated with these archetypes, it really opens the door for a lot of healing to take place. So in the course, what I guide people through is a lot of inner work exploring the roots of these archetypes. I take them into guided meditations working with the archetypes, and then I take them through different energetic clearing practices using a few different techniques to clear a lot of the some of the residue that's still being held, not just in the mind, but in the body and nervous system energetically. So we're working on many different levels, working with the archetypes, and I take them through like systematically each one of them. And the beauty of this course is I'm not just giving you all this information. I'm actually taking you through the practices in real time and the healing work in real time. So the healing is happening as you're going through it. It's not something that I just give you a bunch of information and then you have to go and do something with it. It's very interactive and it's very experiential, not just a bunch of information.
I love that. And Greg, I want to thank you for being on the show today. I appreciate the work that you're doing. It's absolutely amazing. What's your website so people can go get this Healing Your Core Archetypes course?
So my website is healing4d.com, and the course directly is healing4d.com/HCA, which is HCA. Healing Core Archetypes. So healing4d.com/HCA. And if they use the code podcast20, they can get 20% off their enrollment. Okay, awesome. So that offer will be specifically for your listeners.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure we put that in the show notes and have that. Thank you once again, Greg. Appreciate your life's work and who you are and how you've brought this to the world. It's absolutely amazing, and it's the way that we can 4D heal.
Thank you so much for having me.
Look within, and live your life on the edge of two worlds. A reality where you find true understanding of who you are. The learning is done. Become the teacher in embodying the oneness of all. Walk the cliff's edge between the seen and the unseen realities. Become a higher density being. Please go to www.higherdensityliving.com.